Hi, so as we move on to the next slide, let's take another look around this state-of-the-art factory. You can see some marvelous machinery here. Don't ask me what it does, but I'm sure it's hyper efficient and has completely eliminated the need for having people on board, it seems, as it's notably absent in terms of the number of people visible to the naked eye. So anyway, let's talk about the longer term implications of all of this. So firstly, there will be, I'm sure, elements of business culture which will change. The most obvious one is home and flexible working, which, as I said earlier, is going to become the default rather than necessarily having to ask. But I think people are seeing the benefits and having to adjust their behaviour accordingly, which will impact the culture. There are also changes around the pace. So I think moving at pace, becoming faster, and from a development, proposition development point of view as well. Agile methodologies, fail fast methodology, setting up business incubators to look at innovating products. All of these will have implications for behaviour, values, and the way in which business is conducted. The second one is about business continuity, and a lot of organisations have found that although they've spent a lot of time and effort developing continuity plans in the past, in the case of a pandemic, they're absolutely unfit for purpose because they often require you identifying an empty building somewhere or a hangar somewhere in a remote location, which can be utilised if your main operating location no longer functions. However, in the case of a pandemic, it doesn't really help because people are still going to be crowded into a different building, okay, but that's not going to really solve the risk of infection, for example. So a lot of business continuity plans, unfortunately, are not fit for purpose. That's got implications as well for the kinds of leadership skills and capabilities that we need at this time. And it's placed the emphasis very much on crisis leadership and the ability to carry out business recovery. These weren't perhaps the highest priority in the past, but it's clear now that these are really high on the skill sets required, and that will influence the design of leadership capability models and also the developments that you would put in place, both for new people coming into the organisation and for existing people. I think performance management processes will see a lot of shift as well. Performance reviews will often go online in the future, I'm sure, and they'll move away even further from traditional annual appraisal to much more regular, in-the-moment performance feedback. You may well see rating scales being dropped, the link to pay may be de-emphasised or even removed, and there may well be bigger emphasis on outputs rather than inputs that people actually achieve. So I think manager training will be required to back up all of that. The next point is about data security and GDPR. GDPR, we all know the big emphasis that took place last year to bring in new regulations, for example, where the big emphasis was on the protection of individuals' confidential data. However, I think the latest pandemic has shown that because of health and safety requirements and duty of care, that's actually more important, arguably, than the right to privacy. For example, if individual employees have COVID-19, the organisation will certainly feel a need to disclose that to co-workers, even if the individual employee does not consent. And we've all seen in China how it's gone a step further, where health data is shared both with the state and also with employers. There's the red, amber, green system, people wearing wristbands, and this dictates what level of freedom of movement people can have, whether or not they can take public transport, for example. So I'm not advocating that we would move to a full Chinese-style methodology, but I think the sharing of such data will become more common. And then the final one is that during this time of furloughing, the government-employer relationship has shifted. So you could say that 25% of the workforce in the UK are being bankrolled by the government. And the government's had to waive the normal kind of state aid rules to be able to directly intervene in the relationship between the employer and the employee and to basically provide bailouts, which is a fundamental shift in the role of government. And the question will be longer term, how does that stack up? So quite apart from the fact we're going to have to repay a lot of this through our taxation, will this mean that the the role between government and employer is actually shifted on a long-term basis. So let's move on to the next slide.